Well, good morning. I hope this video finds you well. And for us at Bryan College, we're entering the Passion Week, the final week of Jesus before dying on the cross. We'll celebrate that a week from now. And it's interesting that we happen to be looking at Psalm 22 today, and the whole idea of the last words of Jesus from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the quotation there of Psalm 22 is very interesting and brings up how we should approach the Psalms and some issues on the trustworthiness of our English translations. And so this is going to be a great time for us to look at this together. And I invite you to get a Bible, and we will look at this. And as always, let's start our class with prayer. Father, I pray that you help us today. In the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, as we are doing classes in non-traditional ways, I pray that you help us. I pray you protect us. Pray you give our leaders wisdom and our medical doctors great skill in slowing this pandemic. I pray that the order to shelter at home would be heeded, and that we could blunt the growth of this pandemic here in America. Father, would you help us today as we look at your word? Would you help us understand? Would you open our minds to the scriptures? We pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. So we're looking today at Psalm 22, and we're going to take two sessions on this, so Monday and Wednesday. And we're going to touch on this idea of textual criticism. One of the textual criticism is the name when you have two ancient documents both claiming to represent an original reading. When they differ, how do you decide which one is right and which one isn't? And for Christians, the whole idea of textual criticism, if you're in a tradition like mine and like Bryan College, where we believe that the Bible is true, we support the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy. The statement is that we believe in the original manuscripts, that the Bible is without error. So it raises the question, well, can I trust my English Bible? Is my English Bible good? How do I know that what is in the text is exactly what God wants inspired? And that's what we're going to look at today, and in this section on textual criticism. And we're going to begin to look at Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is important because when Jesus was on the cross and as he was dying, he uttered the opening words of Psalm 22. And in two of the accounts, it's the only thing that Jesus says from the cross. All four of the Gospels point to Psalm 22 as being key to understanding the Jesus event. And so all this is tied up together in terms of textual criticism, and the issue in Psalm 22 is in the middle of Psalm 22, you have that famous phrase, they pierced my hands and feet. And many would contend that that's not the original reading. Whether it's original or no, it's clear that Jesus quoted Psalm 22, but the statement, "They pierced my hands and feet," if that is original, then it raises all kinds of interpretive issues and suggestions. And so it's all tied together, and that's what we're going to look at today. And please remember, as always, at the end of this video, to make a forum post and to reply to someone else's forum post. So the primary issue that kind of sparks this whole thing is, can I trust that my Bible is true? And the statement that many would make would be, aren't there mistakes in the text? How can you trust a text that's 3,000 years old? We're talking about ancient documents written 3,000 years ago, and how can we be sure that what we have is right? And if someone asks me, just as a believer, I mean, I could, and we're going to dive into the technical issues. We can look at manuscripts and how many we have and how old they are. But I think before we do that, I would step back and say that God won't let his church be deceived. If God did inspire the Bible, is it likely that he would let his church be dominated by a reading or by something that wasn't what he wanted? It doesn't seem that that's really the way the God of the Bible is presenting himself. The God of the Bible is presenting himself as absolute truth. And would God let us be deceived? And I would add to that, God's given us absolutely enough evidence. There's no question about the evidence. We have so much evidence what the original readings are that it's just overwhelming. It isn't that there's not evidence, it's that, is it worth looking at? And there are many people who want the Bible not to be true, and so it becomes an easy way to say, well, we can't know, nobody can know, this is just some old thing, don't worry about it. I want to try to make the case today that there is enough evidence, and we can know. So when we come to Psalm 22, Psalm 22 is important because of all the passages in Scripture. Psalm 22 is the passage that Jesus chose to quote as he was dying on the cross. And so in Matthew, we have this about the 9th hour. Jesus cried out with a loud voice. That's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We've seen that that's the time when the Passover lambs are being sacrificed. So this is moments before Jesus' death. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." And then Matthew translates that for us, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The lama sabachthani part is in Aramaic, which was Jesus' mother tongue. Aramaic is a Semitic language. It's very close to Hebrew. If you know Hebrew very well, my Aramaic teacher said, if you know Hebrew well, you can learn Aramaic in 2 weeks. That's kind of true. It's not a very complex language. Much of the vocabulary is exactly the same as Hebrew. Once you know it, it's very close, closer than Portuguese is to Spanish or Sicilian is to Italian. The Eli part looks like it's Hebrew to me, my God, but it's quoting the first part of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? When Mark gives the account, he gives it Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And that's just all Aramaic, or some people say it's a particular Aramaic dialect called Syriac. And it does agree with that as well as my memory serves me. But he's quoting from Psalm 22, and someone might say, well, why are they different? Well, it could be that they're giving what they heard, and Jesus in the dying gasp, it could be that they're hearing it slightly differently, or it could be that Matthew is just helping us. His audience was a Jewish audience, and he may be helping his audience connect the Eli. I'm not sure, but what no one questions is that it's a quotation of the first verse of Psalm 22. When we look at Jesus's complete record, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you could make the case that Jesus said 7 things. Father, forgive them, they don't know not what they do. That's in Luke. Today you will be with me in paradise. That's in Luke. Woman, behold your son. That's in John. Then this middle one, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's in Matthew and Mark. But Psalm 22 and the details of Psalm 22 are throughout the Passion narrative accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all have elements that come. The 5th statement, I thirst. The 6th, it is finished. Some people have argued that that may be a quotation of the last verse of Psalm 22. The Lord said it, the Lord did it. And coupling with that, perhaps Ezekiel 36. And then the last statement, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. I don't know if that is intended by God. It is interesting that there are 7, and that the middle one is the only thing quoted by Matthew and Mark. And the issue then in terms of textual criticism, so we're doing 2 things in this lecture. We're talking about Psalm 22, but we're also looking at the issue of, can I trust what my English Bible says? That is going to revolve around this statement from Psalm 22, and the numbers in the English are slightly different, verse 16 and verses 17, depending on whether you are looking at the Hebrew text or the English. But this statement, they have pierced my hands and feet. Now, obviously, if Jesus quotes the initial verse, may allude to the end verse, I don't know. But if Jesus is quoting that, and if Psalm 22 says, they have pierced my hands and feet, then that never was true of David. David never had his hands and feet pierced, and so Christians have been making the argument since very early that Psalm 22 can't be about David, that it's about Jesus. And if the reading is, they've pierced my hands and feet, that argument becomes very, very powerful. And it's very powerful indeed, because in antiquity, we have evidence here in the bottom left on this slide. The older looking thing is actually an ancient artifact. And that ancient artifact was a man who had been crucified. They couldn't get the nail out, and so they just cut the man's foot off and threw the nail, wood, and everything in the grave. And of course, the wood rotted over time, and the man's bone was left. And you can see that this man was crucified through his heel bone, I'm not sure that I would have understood that that's how they were doing it had it not been for this artifact. But here's evidence of crucifixion happening, and when particular pain wanted to be inflicted on the criminal, they would crucify them with their hands and feet. And so if the text says they have pierced my hands and feet, and this is hundreds of years before crucifixion as a way of execution was brought forward by the Romans, then Psalm 22 must be predictive prophecy and must be about Jesus. But if you know anything about the translation of this verse, you may know that there's great debate about, is this really what the Hebrew text says? And so that's our jumping off point into this idea of textual criticism. And textual criticism isn't criticizing a text, saying, oh, this text is wrong or something like that. No, textual criticism is just simply the field of study in any discipline, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, whatever, when you have ancient documents, both claiming to represent an original text, and you have to decide which one is the right reading. And if you go to the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., they're doing textual criticism on Shakespeare. You know, what did Shakespeare really write? And so they collect all the manuscripts there and the folios, and you can see them. 41 of the most ancient folios of Shakespeare. They're doing textual criticism. So you're not criticizing the text, you're not judging the text. It's simply the name of the academic discipline. When you have two manuscripts that disagree, how do you decide which one is right? And so on this issue of they pierced my hands and feet, that's a textual critical issue. They call it a text variant. And you have to decide, well, is it pierced or is it something else? That's what we're going to look at. Now, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, we don't have any of the original manuscripts. Whatever they were written on long ago, they perished, and so we can't go back to a manuscript and say, this is, what Moses wrote, here it is, this is what John wrote. We just don't have those. Those are called the autographs. That is, when Isaiah wrote Isaiah, the autograph, the original one, we don't have any of those. We don't have them for Psalms. We don't have them for the New Testament. But this is what we do have. When Erasmus published his Greek New Testament in 1516, he had 7 Greek manuscripts, and that was really good in 1516. He had a lot of manuscripts. We have over 5,000 today, and they're early, they're good. Textual criticism is the discipline of trying to determine the original reading when you have 2 different manuscripts reading 2 different things. When you do have that, the difference is called a textual variant. How do you decide which variant is right? Now, I was trained in my undergraduate degree in classical Greek. And all we ever did, all day, every day, was read ancient Greek text in Greek. We didn't write papers. We didn't do other things. We just read Greek. We read it over and over and read all kinds of things. And there were times in that class where we would read a book. I think I remember reading the Athenian Constitution by Aristotle, and that book started ... because we didn't have the first pages of that manuscript. It was gone. And if you look at these ancient documents, you can see of Lucretius, we have 2, and the difference is about 1,100 years. Plato, 1,200 years. Herodotus, Thucydides, Suetonius, all that, a low number of manuscripts and a big gap between when they were written and what we have. And you can see that that's true until you get to the New Testament. The New Testament, we have over 5,000. They agree 99% of the time. Take the worst one out there, and 99% of the time it's going to agree exactly with all the other manuscripts. There is no point of doctrine, major doctrine, that depends on any kind of textual variant. And some of the manuscripts that we have come from less than 100 years when they were written. In fact, when I was in England as a PhD student, one day some friends of mine and I decided to drive over to the University of Manchester and use their library for research. And when we got over there, a friend of mine said, you know, they have P52 in the John Rylands library. Should we ask to see it? And I was a little timid, but my friend insisted, and so we asked the curator, and he let us see it. And this is the oldest manuscript then that we have. We have a manuscript perhaps that's older now, but I still remember my friend twirling that manuscript between his fingers, looking at this text that's, perhaps within 20 years of when John was written. At the most, it's probably 50 years from when it was written. So incredible, incredibly old manuscript. And so the wealth that we have of textual evidence is just amazing. So what we have, whenever a document was written, when Psalm 22 was written or John was written, think of that as the original autograph. That's the one the person wrote down on the piece of paper, on the cowskin, whatever, for the first time. And then you might imagine that that would be copied a number of times, and you can think of these as the original copies. And if you were writing John, you might send it to Ephesus or to Rome or to Jerusalem or something like that. And so what you get is textual families. And so what we have today is something maybe like this. We have a few early manuscripts, we have a few more middle manuscripts, and then we have a lot of fairly recent manuscripts. So when you come to textual criticism, whether you're in Shakespeare or Latin or Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic, there are 5 canons, they call them, canons of textual criticism, 5 principles that you apply when you're determining a textual variant. And the first is the earlier reading is to be preferred. And if you think of this situation, say you had a textual variant here that read one thing and a textual variant here that read another thing, well, other things being equal, this one's more likely to be the one that's right. Say this was copied in 200 and this was copied in 1200. And the reason that that is more likely to be right is because this may have only been copied one time and this was copied many, many times. So other things being equal, the earlier reading is to be preferred. The second principle, canon, is that the reading most widely represented geographically is to be preferred. And you can think about how that might work. If John sent it to Rome and to Corinth and to Ephesus and to Jerusalem, and you had one family that all agreed, and none of the other families agreed with that, well, the one that's most widely represented geographically is probably right. And the reason is because if this guy makes a mistake, that mistake's going to be copied in this line, but it's not going to affect over here. So when dealing with this, they teach you to look at textual families. And in New Testament studies, there are four. The Western, the Byzantine, the Caesarean, and the Alexandrian, and to see, which family does this belong to. Third canon is that the harder reading is to be preferred. If you have a reading that's easy and you have a reading that's really hard, more than likely it's the hard one that's right, because scribes had a tendency to try to fix things that they didn't understand. And you can see that in the text over time. If there's a historic difficulty or something, often they'll try to smooth that out. And often it comes from not fully understanding how the resolution is made. It's something hard to them, but it's hard because they don't understand something about the culture. Fourth canon is that the shorter reading is to be preferred. And some of these actually have Latin names: Lectio Difficilior Patior, Lectio Brevior Patior. Scribes had a tendency to add rather than subtract. So if you have two readings and one's long and one's short, it's usually the short one that's right. But then the chief one is the reading that can explain how all the other readings got there. That's the one that's right. So you get all 5,000 manuscripts and you look and you say, which one can explain how all the other readings came into being. So can we trust our Bibles, both Old Testament and New Testament? And I know this is the Old Testament class, but we're stepping back and just looking at the whole Bible here for a second. Well, absolutely we can trust, because we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. They're finding manuscripts even today. We have a lot of evidence. And even if you put all 5,000 of those manuscripts in a warehouse and that warehouse burned to the ground, we have 5,000 translation manuscripts. So the Bible's been translated into so many languages over such a long time that if we didn't have any of the original language ones, we would still have many ancient translations. Those manuscripts, some of them are very close to the time of the writing. If you put all 5,000 in a warehouse and it burned down and you burned all the translations, you could still reconstruct the entire text simply from the quotes from the church fathers. And no point of essential doctrine depends on a textual variant. It's amazing the evidence that we have. I was privileged for a very short time to study textual criticism under one of the leading text critics in the world, a man who had gone to Harvard, J. Harold Greenlee, and did a PhD, and he knew 60-something languages, and he wrote a dissertation on palimpsest, that is manuscripts where they'd scraped the words off and written another work on top of it. Many of those palimpsest manuscripts originally had been Bibles. And so here's a guy who had spent his academic career with, magnifying glass trying to figure out words that had been partially scraped off. The people who have done this for us are incredibly gifted, and we absolutely can trust our Bibles. In terms of the Old Testament, there are four main Hebrew witnesses. So, we've got 5,000 manuscripts for the Greek. We don't have that for the Hebrew. But what we do have are four main witnesses. One is the Masoretic text, and we're going to talk about what that is. We have the Samaritan Pentateuch. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have a thing called the Cairo Geniza. And so you can look and see, well, what do all of those things read? In terms of translations of the Hebrew, we have at least five. We have the Septuagint, meaning the 70 people under Ptolemy translated the first five books. We have some revisions, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. Then it was translated into Latin the late 4th century, and we have the Aramaic Targums. In terms of the Targums, we have Jonathan and Onkelos, and we also have an ancient Jewish translation called the Syriac Peshitta. Now, scholars, at least some that I've talked to when you're in the New Testament, 99% of the text is certain. You take any manuscript and you're going to get that 99% of the time. For the Hebrew text, it's a little lower, maybe 92% is uncontested. But there are places where you get, and this is an example from Psalm 22, some texts will read of my folly, and others will read of my groaning. And that's a metathesis of two letters. Is it S-G-A or is it S-A-G? And you'll get readings like that where you've got the basic word, but there's a question on the order of letters or the propriety of an individual letter. So you say, well, why should I care about any of that? Well, because in Psalm 22:16, we have a textual variant. They pierced my hands and my feet. And we have the issue that Jesus was crucified in that manner. But the problem is there's a textual variant in this verse. So our ESV translation says, dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. That's what the ESV says. If we go to Tanakh, which is the Jewish Publication Society translation, Tanakh translates it, dogs surrounded me, and you can see that's the same, dogs encompass me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me, and you can see that's the same in the ESV, a company of evildoers encircles me. But then Tanakh says, like lions, they maul my hands and feet. So every text is going to read hands and feet, but the question is it they pierce my hands and feet, or is it like lions? Well, it turns out that the difference between those two readings is the difference between these two words. This is they blanked my hands and feet. This is like a lion. And you can see these are exactly the same things, except the final letter in this one is long, and the final letter in this one is short, but the difference is the tail long or is the tail short and at an angle? Is it a difference between a vav, the V sound, or a yod, the Y sound? So I imagine you would grant, would you not, that this is a pretty small difference. This is not a debate about what letters are there. It's in this letter is the tail of the letter long or short. This is a textual variant. We have ancient manuscripts that read both of these, or two manuscripts that read either one. So the question is, which one is right? And some people say, well, it's impossible to know. You've got a document 3,000 years old. How in the world could you decide whether it's a long letter or a short letter? And I would say, well, let's see. Let's dive in. Let's look at the evidence. If this is the word, then those three letters would mean something like they chiseled through, or they dug through, or they bound my hands and feet. You can make a case for any one of those three. But there is a question about this letter. Before, you may remember that we've talked before how originally there are no vowels in Hebrew, and you have to, even in modern Hebrew, you have to supply your own vowels as you read. Early in the textual tradition, they came up with a thing called mater lectionis, a mother of reading, and they would put this aleph, and what we're going to call an A-class letter, they would put that there sometimes to say, hey, put a A-class vowel when you read this. And so there are a handful of mater lectioni. I think that's the way you say it. There are a handful of them that are used. And so you'll get words written sometimes with the mater lectionis and sometimes without. And so it turns out that you can have that Kop Aleph Resh and the Kop Resh, those are the same thing, whether it has the mater lectionis or not. It'll become clear. But if that's the reading with the long-tailed letter, then it's something like they chiseled. And if it's this one, then in this one, the cat is the word like, and then the Ari is a lion. And you may have a Jewish friend. I hope you do have a Jewish friend. But often Jewish people might have a name like Ari Shapiro, and that means something like the beautiful lion. Well, it's just this word, Ari. So Ka-Ari is like a lion. So is it Ka-Ari or is it Ka-Aru is the issue. Okay, this is the manuscript. This is manuscript B19A. This is the oldest complete Hebrew manuscript that we have. It's kept in, I believe, in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. When St. Petersburg was under communist rule, it was called Leningrad. And so many people will call this the Leningrad Codex or Codex L. In the library there in St. Petersburg, it's called manuscript B19A. So B19A or manuscript L, same thing. This is the Hebrew manuscript that all printed Hebrew Bibles, at least all the main ones, are just simply a very faithful reproduction of this one manuscript, manuscript B19A. And it was copied in 1008 AD. And we know it was copied then because the guy who copied it signed his name and dated it. So this is a medieval manuscript. It's the oldest medieval manuscript that we have. It's a complete copy of the Hebrew Bible, and it's in St. Petersburg, Russia. This is the page that it comes from. And so here is our reading. They surrounded me. Dogs did, a congregation of evildoers. They hem me in. You have the ethna here, that's like a comma in Hebrew. And then we have the reading ka-e-ri. So the question is this a short vowel or is it the long vowel? So here is the letter. And if you want a comparison, so this will be the long, another version of the long one. And this would be an example of the short one. And so if you go back and forth and look at those, it's pretty clear that this letter is exactly the same as this letter, which means that the reading of B19 is like a lion. B19 does not read, they pierce my hands and feet. B19 reads like a lion. And I imagine you might say, well, if B19 reads like a lion, well, doesn't that mean that the ESV has misled us, because the ESV has, they pierced my hands and feet, and we can see that B19a reads like a lion. That is true, that B19a reads like a lion. The question is B19a representative of what David wrote? So this is a case where textual criticism is absolutely important. We have manuscripts that differ. Which one's right? Remember our canon, we say, well, which one's the oldest reading? Well, many people think that B19a was copied from the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex dates from 930 AD, so this is about 78 years younger, or older, 78 years older than B19a. I took a trip to Israel once. I was in the Shrine of the Book. I was walking around and I stumbled across a display. It happened to be the Aleppo Codex. I about had a heart attack because I'd been studying Psalm 22 and I wanted to know what the Aleppo Codex said. And when I leaned over to look, I realized that the Aleppo Codex was open to about Psalm 35, and how I wanted someone, oh, come unlock the glass, let's look. Well, it turns out that many pages have been ripped out of the Aleppo Codex. It's missing some of the first pages, like through Deuteronomy, and then the page that would have had Psalm 22 on it has been ripped out of the Aleppo Codex. So we don't know. Every now and then a family, when the Aleppo Codex was in Aleppo, Syria, and they would have a riot, people would go in and steal pages, and every now and then we'll get a page back. A family will have had a page, for 100 years, and their consciences will be plagued, and every now and then they'll send it back. So maybe this will be sent back, but we don't have Psalm 22, so we don't know what the Aleppo Codex reads. If we go back a couple more centuries, the Psalm Targum has two readings. Biding how just like a lion. And what that is called a double translation. When ancient translators didn't know what to do, often they would give two different translations, and they would just put both of them in the text. That's what's happening here. So they're reading like a lion, and notice we have our short vowel, but they're also saying you could read that as biders of. So it could be construct, plural participle, biders of my hands and feet, or like a lion, my hands and feet. So the Psalm Targum admits that you may be able to read the ka'ar part as a verb. They're just unclear exactly how, so they put both in there. If we go back, next oldest thing would be the Cairo Geniza. This is a treasury. They found a whole room full of ancient manuscripts in a place where they'd been copying. Believe it or not, I think this is Solomon Schechter, went through all of these and found all of the readings from the text. And so we have these ancient copies, and these are almost 400 or 500 years older than B19. And we have Psalm 22 represented, and it's clear that that reads like a lion. That used to be as far back as you could go in terms of manuscript evidence. And so someone would say, well, you haven't shown me any evidence for they pierced, and that's true. If we went to the translation evidence, Jerome Zeux de Hebreus has Vinxerunt, which means they bound, and notice it's reading the longer letter without the mater lectionis. So this would be evidence of a text, but it is translational evidence. Before he learned Hebrew, he translated from the Septuagint, and he translated, they dug. It's the same three radicals, same three letters, but he gives it a different meaning. The Old Latin has, they dug my hands and feet. Now, when we come to Aquila, the first time translates it, they disfigured my hands and feet. And he's reading ka-eru with a guttural ion. What's so important about Aquila is Aquila was not a believer. In fact, Aquila had dabbled in Christianity and decided that Christianity wasn't true, and he was making a translation trying to move people away from the Christian faith. And so when he translates Psalm 22, he translates it, they disfigured my hands and feet. But the important thing to see there is he's reading a verb, not like a lion. He's looking at his manuscript, and he's not saying it reads like a lion. He's saying it reads a verb, and the end letter is a long letter. He changed his view to, and Jerome and he agree they have bound, reading that without the mater lectionis. Symmachus, I'm not sure what he's reading, perhaps the plural participle, I don't know. We don't have Theodotion. But what we do have is the Peshitta that reads, they pierced my hands and feet, and that's about 100 AD. But all these are translation. And you might say, well, show me a manuscript. Well, since 1947 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have found ancient manuscripts. This is Cave 1 from Qumran. Cave 4 at Qumran, the 88th manuscript, has Psalm 22, and it reads, they dug. Because it doesn't have the aleph there, it can't read like a lion. So 4Q88 is Hebrew evidence. And remember, B19A was written in 1008 AD. 4Q88 is 1,000 years older. They dug through. And it isn't just 4Q88. We have 5-6 Nahal Hever. And you can see for yourself. Here's the reading. Is that the short vowel or is it the long? This is an evidence of a short. Clearly, this is the long. It's reading ka-eru exactly the way the ESV translates it. We will pick up here next time. I hope you have a great week. Hope Easter is wonderful for you, and I look forward to talking to you next time.